I remember that evening like it was yesterday. The setting sun spilled orange hues through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room where I sat, my mind a swirl of disbelief and anger. It was just another ordinary day until my phone buzzed with a message from Dave, an old buddy from college. "Hey, man, saw something odd. Thought you should know," the message read. I called him immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jake, I saw Lizzie at the cafe downtown." Dave's voice was hesitant. "She was with some guy. Looked cozy. Didn't seem like a work thing." My world stopped. Lizzie, my wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, in a cafe with another man? It couldn't be true. I confronted her that night. She walked in, her hair slightly disheveled, a flush to her cheeks. She was beautiful, as always, but something in her eyes flickered when she saw the look on my face. "Lizzie, are you seeing someone else?" My voice was steady, but inside, I was crumbling. There was a pause, a moment suspended in time, where I hoped it was all a misunderstanding. But then she said it, her voice cold and detached. "Yes, I am. It's my boss, Mark. And I won't stop." I couldn't believe it. The woman I loved, the one I shared my dreams in bed with, was telling me she was having an affair, and she wasn't sorry. There was no apology, no tears, just a blunt confession. "What about us, Lizzie? What about our marriage?" I was grasping at straws, trying to find some sliver of the woman I married in her eyes. "Our marriage? Jake, I need more. I need excitement, passion. You just don't get it." That night, I left. I packed a bag with shaking hands, my mind a blur of memories and broken dreams. Walking out of our shared home, I felt a mix of freedom and guilt. Freedom from a lie I had been living, and guilt for not seeing it sooner. The street was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps that cast long shadows on the pavement. I walked without direction, my steps echoing in the quiet night. I had loved her with all my heart, but in that moment, I realized love wasn't always enough. As I wandered through the streets, my mind replayed our years together. The laughter, the fights, the quiet moments, and the loud ones. All of it felt like a distant dream, shattered by the harsh reality of her betrayal. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The life I knew, the life I loved, was over. And in its place was a gaping hole, filled with questions, doubts, and the overwhelming pain of betrayal. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A chapter where I was alone, thrust into an unfamiliar world without the person I thought would be by my side forever. But sometimes, you need to lose everything to find out who you really are. And this was my beginning. The day Lizzie moved out, the house felt strangely empty, like someone had sucked the air out of it. I watched from the window as she loaded her things into her car, her movements swift and determined. There wasn't any of the hesitation you might expect from someone leaving their life behind. It was as if she was eager to start anew, without me. I wasn't surprised when I heard about her job promotion a few weeks later. Mark, her boss, and now the reason for our broken marriage, had always favored her. I could imagine them in the office, her laughing at his jokes, him gazing at her with that look men have when they're more than just interested. It stung, but not in the way it used to. It was more of a dull, constant ache, a reminder of what was lost. With the new job came a new Lizzie. She traded her modest sedan for a sleek sports car, one that roared down the street as she drove away from what used to be our home. Her clothes became more expensive, her nights out more frequent. Through the grapevine of mutual friends, I heard about her parties, her trips to exotic places, her name on VIP lists at clubs. It was a lifestyle she had always craved but never had with me. But as her life became more lavish, her circle of friends started shrinking. Our old friends, The ones we used to have game nights with slowly distanced themselves. I'd see them occasionally, and the look in their eyes was a mix of pity and discomfort. They didn't know how to talk about Lizzie, or maybe they didn't want to. She had become a taboo topic, a ghost haunting our conversations. The news of her engagement to Mark came as a rumor at first. I was grabbing a coffee when I overheard someone at the next table. "Did you hear about Lizzie and her boss? Engaged already, can you believe it?" The words hit me like a punch in the gut. Engaged. The word echoed in my mind as I walked back home, the coffee forgotten and growing cold in my hand. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice of it all. Another part of me, a quieter, more resigned part, was just tired. Tired of the drama, the pain, the constant reminders of a life that was no longer mine. That night, I sat in our my living room, the silence enveloping me. The walls were lined with pictures of happier times, mocking me with memories of a past that felt like a different life. I realized then that it wasn't just Lizzie who had moved out. It was the laughter, the love, the warmth. All of it gone, leaving behind nothing but empty spaces. As I looked around, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I had to learn who I was without Lizzie. It was a daunting thought, but in that vast, echoing silence, I found a glimmer of something like hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again in the ruins of what we had. Maybe, in the end, that was what I needed all along. After Lizzie left, the months blurred into a mosaic of routine and solitude. Life without her was a quiet hum, uneventful and monotonous. But her life, as I heard through hushed conversations and secondhand stories, was anything but. She dove into wedding planning with a fervor that surprised even those who knew her well. Lizzie had always loved the finer things, and her wedding was shaping up to be a spectacle. I heard about the lavish venue, the designer dress, the guest list that read like a who's who of the city's elite. It seemed like she was living in a dream, a fairy tale spun from silk and diamonds. But fairy tales don't always have happy endings. As the wedding drew closer, whispers reached my ears about the friends she was losing. The same friends who had shared our dinner table, laughed at our jokes, were now turning their backs on her. They couldn't reconcile the Lizzie they knew with the woman who had betrayed her husband and flaunted her affair. In their place, a new crowd gathered around her. People drawn to the glitz and glamour, to the allure of scandal. I saw pictures of her online, always smiling, always surrounded by these new friends. But her eyes, once bright with genuine joy, now held a glint of something else. Desperation, maybe, or loneliness. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my life in a way I never expected. I started focusing more on my hobbies, got back in touch with old friends, even began dating again. It wasn't easy, moving on from the wreckage of a failed marriage, but I was finding moments of happiness in the unlikeliest of places. When Lizzie heard about my new life, I wondered how she felt. Did she regret her decisions? Did she envy the simple, honest happiness I was finding? I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she'd asked about me, her voice tinged with something that sounded like regret. Then came her wedding day, a day that should have been perfect. But it wasn't. The disaster struck out of nowhere, like a storm on a clear day. The lavish venue she had booked went bankrupt just days before the wedding. The news spread like wildfire, a juicy piece of gossip for those who thrived on schadenfreude. The wedding was hastily moved to a lesser venue, one that lacked the opulence Lizzie had so desired. Guests murmured, the glamour of the event tarnished by the last-minute change. I heard about it from a friend, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of something. Not happiness, certainly, but not sadness either. It was a complex mix of emotions, a reminder of the life we once dreamed of together, now just a faded echo. That day, as Lizzie walked down the aisle in a less grandiose setting, with fewer friends and a crowd of strangers, I found myself at a small cafe, the sun warm on my face, a faint smile on my lips. Life had taken us on divergent paths, paths that once intertwined but were now worlds apart. In that moment, sipping my coffee and watching the world go by, I realized something important. Happiness isn't found in the grand gestures or the lavish parties. It's in the small, quiet moments, the ones that pass unnoticed if you're not careful. And as Lizzie said her vows in a setting far removed from her dreams, I hoped she would find that happiness too, in her own way, on her own path. Months had passed since Lizzie's wedding. The glitz and glamour of the big day had faded, replaced by the reality of a marriage built on shaky ground. I heard bits and pieces about her life with Mark through mutual friends, and none of it sounded like the happy ending she had envisioned. Their troubles began early, the honeymoon phase barely lasting. Mark, who had once showered her with affection and gifts, had become distant and preoccupied. Lizzie, accustomed to being the center of attention, struggled with the sudden change. She'd call me sometimes, under the guise of discussing some leftover joint financial matter, but her voice often betrayed her loneliness and frustration. Then came the financial troubles. Their lavish lifestyle, funded by two incomes that seemed limitless, hit a snag. I heard that Mark's business was in trouble, and the luxurious trips, the fancy dinners, and the high-end shopping sprees became a source of contention. Lizzie, who had never been good with money, found herself in a web of credit card debts and unpaid bills. The strain on their marriage was palpable, even from a distance. Then, whispers of infidelity began to surface. Lizzie had always been possessive, and now, insecure in her tumultuous marriage, she grew paranoid. She suspected Mark of having an affair, her trust eroded by the foundation of their own relationship and affair. One evening, they had a heated argument at a restaurant, a place I used to go to with Lizzie. It was a high-end, exclusive place, the kind where everyone knew everyone. Word got around quickly. She accused him of seeing someone else, her voice rising with every word, drawing the attention of the entire restaurant. Mark, calm and collected, denied everything, but the damage was done. The scene ended with Lizzie storming out, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. That public spectacle was the talk of the town for days. Friends who were there told me how embarrassed she looked, how people whispered and pointed. Lizzie, who had always cared so much about appearances, had her private life exposed for all to see. After that incident, her calls to me stopped. I could only imagine the turmoil she was going through. A part of me felt sorry for her. Despite everything, I remembered the good times we had shared, the dreams we had built together. But another part of me knew this was the inevitable outcome of the choices she had made. Sitting in my quiet living room, far removed from the chaos of Lizzie's world, I reflected on how our lives had diverged. We had started on the same path, but somewhere along the way, we had taken different turns. Her path had led her to a world of glitz but little substance, a house of cards waiting to collapse. Mine had been quieter, less dramatic, but in many ways, more fulfilling. Life, I realized, is about choices. The choices we make define us, shape our paths, and determine our happiness. And sometimes, the pursuit of something more, something better, leads us away from what truly matters. I hoped, for Lizzie's sake, that she would find her way back to what was real and meaningful, but I knew that was a journey she would have to make on her own. It's strange how life can turn on a dime. One minute you're up, the next you're spiraling down so fast it makes your head spin. That's what happened to Lizzie, my ex, the woman I once thought I'd spend my life with. The beginning of her downfall started with an old flame. I heard from mutual friends, ones who still talk to me, anyway that her first love, a guy from her college days, had reappeared. They started meeting in secret, rekindling what they had lost years ago. Lizzie, already struggling in her marriage, seemed to be searching for something, a piece of her past, maybe, or an escape from her present. But secrets have a way of coming out. Mark, her husband, caught them. I don't know the details, but I can imagine the scene, the shock, the anger, the sense of betrayal. It wasn't long after that he filed for divorce. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their marriage had begun with an affair and now was ending because of another. Their divorce turned messy real quick. There was a bitter dispute over assets. The house, the cars, the savings, everything was up for grabs. Lizzie, who had once lived for luxury, found herself fighting to keep a semblance of the lifestyle she was accustomed to. Around the same time, she lost her job. The scandal of her affair and the divorce had reached her workplace. In a world where reputation is everything, hers was tarnished beyond repair. She tried to put on a brave face, but I knew she was struggling. The high-flying executive, once the talk of the town for her success, was now the subject of pitying glances and gossip. Then came the isolation. The friends who had flocked to her side during her days of glamour started to drift away. In their place was a gaping void of loneliness. The reality hit her hard. When you're up, everyone wants to be your friend. But when you're down, that's when you see who's real and who's not. Desperate to maintain her lifestyle, Lizzie resorted to questionable means. I heard rumors, nothing concrete, but whispers of dodgy deals, of debts to the wrong kind of people. She was spiraling, grasping at straws to hold onto a life that was slipping away. Legal trouble soon followed. Something about fraud. Again, I didn't know the details, but it was serious. The law caught up with her, and her once bright future seemed dimmer than ever. The final blow was the public exposure of her scandal. It was all over the news, social media, everywhere. The details of her affairs, her divorce, her legal troubles, all laid bare for the world to see. Lizzie, who had once thrived in the spotlight, was now its victim. Sitting in my quiet living room, a world away from the chaos of her life, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Lizzie and I had shared something real once, before it all went wrong. But choices have consequences, and hers had caught up with her in the most devastating way. Her story, once a tale of success and glamour, had turned into a cautionary tale of loss and despair. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across my floor, I realized that life is a series of choices, and each one leads us down a path. Some paths lead to happiness, others to ruin. Lizzie's path had led her to a place of isolation and regret, a far cry from the bright future she once seemed destined for. I watched from a distance, a bystander to the drama that unfolded. Her court battle was the beginning of the end. Charged with fraud, she stood before a judge, her face a mask of fear and defiance. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Every eye was on her as the prosecutor laid out the case, painting a picture of deceit and desperation. The verdict was a blow that echoed through her life. Guilty. The word hung in the air, heavy with consequence. In the aftermath, her assets were seized. The luxury car, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, all taken as part of the legal proceedings. It was a swift, brutal stripping away of the life she had built. Public opinion, once her ally, now turned against her. The same people who had celebrated her success now reveled in her downfall. She became a social pariah, her name synonymous with scandal. The whispers and stares followed her everywhere, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. In her desperation, Lizzie tried to claw back some semblance of her former life. She attempted to mingle in social circles, but the doors that once opened so easily for her were now firmly shut. Her attempts were met with cold shoulders and turnbacks. The world she once ruled had cast her out. Amidst the chaos, a new love interest entered her life. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. He was different from the others, or so she thought. He seemed to understand her, to accept her despite her tarnished reputation. But it was not to be. In a cruel twist of fate, he too betrayed her, leaving her more alone than ever. That was when she hit rock bottom. The realization of how far she had fallen was a painful awakening. The woman who once had everything now had nothing. Her home, once a symbol of her success, was lost to financial ruin. Evicted, she found herself with nowhere to go, her belongings stuffed into boxes, a stark contrast to the life she once led. Even her family, who had stood by her through thick and thin, reached their breaking point. The strain of her legal troubles, the scandal, the public disgrace, it was too much. They distanced themselves, unable to bear the weight of her choices. And then came the health crisis. A scare that landed her in the hospital, alone and vulnerable. It was a stark reminder of her mortality, of the fragile thread that life hangs on. Sitting in my quiet house, the news of Lizzie's latest misfortune reached me. It was hard to reconcile the image of the vibrant, ambitious woman I had married with the broken figure she had become. I felt a pang of sadness, a remnant of the love we once shared. But it was tempered by the knowledge that her downfall was the result of her own choices, a path she had chosen to walk. Her story, once a tale of triumph, was now a cautionary tale of loss and regret. A reminder that the choices we make have consequences, that the pursuit of wealth and status can lead to ruin. In the end, Lizzie's fall from grace was a journey she walked alone, a journey that took her from the heights of success to the depths of despair. But the world wasn't done dealing her blows. The associates she had teamed up with, those she thought were her allies in this new venture, turned on her. They took her money, her ideas, and left her with nothing but broken promises. It was a betrayal that cut deep, leaving her more isolated than ever. In her desperation, she reached out to me. I got an email one day, her words a mix of apology, regret, and a plea for help. But for me, it was too little, too late. The wounds of our past were still raw, the betrayal still fresh. I couldn't find it in me to offer her the support she sought. My response was brief, indifferent. A clear message that I had moved on. That was when she had her moment of clarity. It came to her, as these things often do, in the quiet of the night. She realized the extent of her wrongdoings, the pain she had caused, the bridges she had burned. But, as is often the case, her realization came too late. Despite her newfound understanding, her situation continued to worsen. Debts piled up, her health deteriorated, and the few friends she had left drifted away. She was a ship adrift in a storm, battered by the waves of her own making. Then came the final blow, the legal verdict. The court found her guilty in a case related to her business dealings. It was the nail in the coffin of her attempts at redemption. The sentence was harsh, a reflection of the gravity of her crimes. It was a verdict that sealed her fate. Support, both moral and material, was minimal. The few who had once been close to her now kept their distance, unwilling or unable to be associated with her downfall. It was a lonely time for her, one where she had to face the consequences of her actions alone. The final loss came in the form of her beloved dog, a loyal companion that had been with her through thick and thin. The dog, sick and unable to be cared for by Lizzie in her current state, had to be given up. It was a heart-wrenching decision, one that left her feeling utterly bereft. In the end, Lizzie found herself alone and forgotten. The once successful, vibrant woman had become a shadow of her former self, isolated from the society that once adored her. Friends, family, colleagues, all had turned their backs, leaving her to face her bleak future alone. Her story, once a tale of aspiration and achievement, ended in uncertainty. A future that once seemed so bright was now clouded with despair. Lizzie, who had once had it all, was left with nothing but her regrets and the haunting question of what might have been if only she had made. I remember it like it was yesterday, the day my world turned upside down. I'd just gotten home. The house was quiet, too quiet. There it was, her phone, buzzing with a message that wasn't meant for my eyes. But I saw it, clear as day. Miss you already. Can't wait to see you again. My heart sank. I knew that message wasn't for me. I waited, pacing around the living room like a caged animal until she walked through the door. She was all smiles until she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, but she knew. She could see it in my eyes, the betrayal I felt. I held up her phone, the message still glowing on the screen. "Care to explain this?" I could barely keep my voice steady. The color drained from her face. She stammered, tried to grab the phone, but I was faster. "It's not what you think," she whispered, but we both knew that was a lie. Then came the tears, the sobbing confessions of an affair. It felt like a bad dream. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, she dropped another bombshell. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My mind raced. The life we'd built together, the trust, it was all shattered in an instant. She tried calling him, her lover, but he was gone, vanished into thin air. No answers, just a cold, empty line. It dawned on me that he'd left her to deal with the mess they'd made. I was furious, not just at her, but at him, at the whole damn situation. As I looked at her, crying and broken, a dark thought crept into my mind. Revenge. It was a poisonous thought, but it took root. I knew what I had to do. It was crazy, but in that moment, it made perfect sense. I was going to get back at her in the most unimaginable way possible. My decision was clear, my resolve firm. I was going to turn our already chaotic world upside down. And that's exactly what I set out to do. So there I was, at this painfully dull family gathering, trying to act normal while my mind was a hurricane of revenge and hurt. And then she walked in, my wife's sister, Laura. I never really paid much attention to her before, but that day, she seemed different. Maybe it was the way she laughed or the way the light hit her hair, but something about her caught my eye. We started talking, just casual chit-chat at first. But as the evening wore on, I found myself flirting, something I hadn't done in years. And the crazy thing? She was flirting back. It was like we were in our own little world, and for a moment, I forgot about my wife's betrayal. We agreed to meet up a few days later, just the two of us. I told myself it was just for a drink, just to talk. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. We met at this quiet little bar on the outskirts of town. It felt secretive, like we were both actors in some sordid drama. As we sat there, sipping our drinks, Laura leaned in close. "I've always liked you, you know," she whispered. Her words sent a jolt through me. It was madness, but in that instant, I wanted her. I drove home that night with my mind racing. My wife, oblivious to it all, asked how the night went. "Fine," I muttered, avoiding her gaze. I could tell she knew something was up, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The next few days were a blur. I kept meeting Laura, each encounter more intense than the last. And then, one night, as we lay together in the dim glow of a cheap motel room, I made up my mind. I was going to do it. I was going to get Laura pregnant. It was the perfect revenge. My wife had betrayed me, and now I would betray her in the worst possible way. With her own sister. The plan was twisted, but it made perfect sense in my head. Laura was all for it, caught up in the heat of the moment. As I lay there in the dark, listening to Laura's steady breathing, I couldn't help but wonder what I had become. I was no longer the man I once was, the man my wife had married. I was something else, something darker. But there was no turning back now. The plan was in motion, and I was going to see it through, no matter the cost. I never thought I'd be the guy sneaking around, but here I am, meeting Laura in secret every chance we get. It's like we're hooked on this thrill of the forbidden, and I can't seem to stop. She's everything my wife isn't right now, passionate, eager, alive with desire. And me? I'm just a guy lost in the middle of an affair I never planned. Meanwhile, back at home, it's like living with a ghost. My wife, she's there but not really. She moves through the days, quiet, withdrawn. I can tell she feels it, the growing chasm between us, but she doesn't know the half of it. Sometimes I catch her looking at me, her eyes searching for something, maybe the man she married. But he's long gone. Then, out of nowhere, he shows up. The lover. Mr. Perfect who blew up my life and then skipped town. He's on our doorstep, looking haggard, desperate. My wife. She goes from sad to furious in a heartbeat. She's yelling, demanding answers, and I'm just standing there, watching it all unfold. He's babbling some nonsense about being in trouble, needing help. I don't buy it. Sounds like a con man's sob story. But my wife, she's listening, and I can see something in her eyes, a flicker of the old her. She's always had a soft spot for lost causes. I can't help but wonder what his game is. Why come back now? And then it hits me. He's scared. He's not here for her. He's here because he's got nowhere else to go. It makes me sick, seeing him weasel his way back into her life, playing the victim. The whole scene's a mess. My wife, torn between anger and this misguided need to fix things. The lover, spilling his guts about some trouble he's gotten himself into. And me, the husband, standing in the shadows, wondering how the hell my life got so twisted. I keep seeing Laura, our affair becoming more reckless by the day. It's like we're both trying to outrun reality, get lost in this fantasy where we don't have to face the consequences of our actions. But reality has a way of catching up, and I'm starting to feel the weight of it all, pressing down on me. The lover's still around, sticking to my wife like a bad smell. She's trying to help him, fix whatever mess he's in. Part of me wants to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The other part, the part that used to love her, it's breaking, bit by bit. I lie in bed at night, next to a woman who's become a stranger, and I wonder where it all went wrong. Was it the moment I decided to take revenge? Or was it earlier, when I stopped seeing her for who she was and started seeing only her betrayal? The affair, the lover's return, my wife's loneliness, it's all spinning out of control. And I'm right in the center of it, trying to hold on to something, anything, that makes sense. But the truth is, nothing makes sense anymore. Not the affair, not my marriage, not this life I've somehow created. It's like I'm walking a tightrope, and any moment now, I'm going to fall. And the crazy part? I'm not sure I even care anymore. Just when I thought things couldn't get more twisted, life threw a curveball that knocked the wind out of me. The lover, the guy my wife was sneaking around with, turns out he's my long-lost brother. Yeah, you heard that right. My brother. The shock of it hit me like a freight train. How? Why? Questions swirled in my head, making it hard to think straight. The whole family was in turmoil. My parents, who'd always lamented my brother's disappearance, were suddenly faced with his return, but not in any way they'd imagined. And me? I felt like I was living in some messed up soap opera. The guy the first hated, the one who'd wrecked my marriage, was my own flesh and blood. My wife, she was a mess of emotions. Guilt, confusion, regret, it was written all over her face. She kept saying she didn't know, that if she had, she would have never. But words felt empty, like echoes in a hollow room. Then, as if things couldn't get any more complicated, Laura dropped her bombshell. She was pregnant. With my child. The silence that followed her announcement was deafening. It was like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the world to implode. The pregnancy news was like gasoline on a fire. Tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over. We all sat down for a family dinner, a pathetic attempt at normalcy, but it didn't take long for things to unravel. The dinner table became a battlefield. Accusations flew, old wounds reopened. My wife, looking more lost than ever, tried to speak, but words failed her. Laura, defiant yet scared, clutched at her belly as if to protect her unborn child from the chaos around her. My parents, caught in the middle of this family catastrophe, looked on with a disbelief. And there, across from me, sat my brother, the man I should have grown up with, shared life's ups and downs with. Instead, he was just a stranger, wearing a familiar face. The tension escalated until voices were raised and harsh truths spilled out. It was ugly, all the pent-up anger and hurt pouring out in a torrent of bitter words. I wanted to scream, to tell them all to stop, that this wasn't what a family should be. But the words stuck in my throat. In that moment, I saw the destruction I'd caused. My revenge, my affair with Laura, it wasn't just about me and my wife anymore. It had spiraled out, touching everyone I cared about. The realization was a slap in the face. I'd been so caught up in my own pain, my own desire for revenge, that I'd failed to see the bigger picture. As the evening wore on, the arguments faded into exhausted silence. We were a family in ruins, each of us lost in our own tangled web of emotions. I looked around at the broken faces of my family and wondered how we'd ever put the pieces back together. That night, I lay awake, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. The mess I'd made seemed insurmountable. And the worst part? I knew there was no easy way out. No quick fixes. We were all trapped in this nightmare, and I couldn't help but feel it was all my fault. Life's funny, you know? One minute you're set on a path, sure of everything, and the next, it's like you're in a free fall. That's how I felt when I finally told my wife it was over. I couldn't keep living this lie, not with Laura carrying my child and everything else in shambles. My wife, she didn't take it lying down. She started doing everything she could think of to win me back. Cooked my favorite meals, wore the dress I used to like, tried to talk about the good times. It was heartbreaking, really. But my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every time I looked at her, all I could see were the lies and the betrayal. Then there's my brother, if I can even call him that. He came to me, hat in hand, looking for some brotherly bond or understanding. He told me about our rough childhood, the things he went through after he disappeared. It was a sob story, all right, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for him. He ruined my marriage, and that's not something I can easily forget. The weirdest part of this whole mess? My wife and him, they started getting close. Not in a romantic way, but like two people who've been through the same storm. They'd sit and talk for hours, sharing stories, finding comfort in their mutual pain. It was a bizarre alliance, watching the two people who hurt me the most find solace in each other. Meanwhile, Laura was in her own little world of joy. The pregnancy suited her, brought a glow to her face. We'd meet up, talk about names, about how we'd raise our kid. It was a slice of normal in an otherwise upside-down world. But even those moments were tinged with guilt. Every smile, every plan for the future. I couldn't shake off the feeling that it was built on a foundation of hurt and betrayal. I tried to focus on Laura, on the baby, but it was like walking through a fog of regret. My wife's desperate attempts to win me back, my brother's pleas for understanding. Laura's happiness, it was a tangled web, and I was stuck right in the middle. It's strange, you know, how life takes these turns. How decisions you make, thinking they're for the best, end up turning your world on its head. I thought I wanted revenge, thought it would make me feel better. But all it did was create more pain, more complications. At night, I'd lie awake, wondering how it all got so messed up. My wife, alone in our bed, trying to piece together a broken marriage. My brother, trying to atone for a lifetime of mistakes. Laura, carrying my child, oblivious to the chaos she'd helped create. And me? I was just a guy caught in the eye of a storm I'd helped conjure, trying to figure out how to move forward when every step felt like I was sinking deeper into quicksand. Life's funny like that, always throwing curveballs when you least expect them. And there I was, trying to catch them with my hands tied behind my back. In the thick of all this madness, I guess I wanted clarity, or maybe I just wanted to feel in control again. So I told my wife, straight up, this is it. You decide now. It's him or me. I expected tears, a breakdown maybe. But she just stood there, pale, like I'd knocked the wind out of her. The next few days, she was like a ghost, trying to stitch together what was left of us. I saw it in her eyes, the desperation. She was scrambling for ways to fix things, but deep down, I think we both knew it was too late. The damage was done. Then, things took a darker turn. My so-called brother, his past finally caught up with him. Some guys he'd messed with showed up, looking for payback. I heard the commotion from the other room, shouts, the sound of a scuffle. By the time I got there, it was chaos. That night, as if our lives needed more drama, someone broke into our house. It was like some bad movie, but it was real. Too real. The intruder, probably one of my brother's enemies, was searching for something, tearing the place apart. My wife, she tried to stop him, playing the hero. But it went south real fast. There was a struggle, and she got hurt. I heard her scream, a sound that'll haunt me for the rest of my days. I rushed in, managed to scare the guy off, but the damage was done. She was lying there, hurt and scared, and for a moment, all our problems seemed so small. I forgot about the affair, the betrayal, everything. All I could see was her, the woman I once promised to protect, now injured because of this twisted web we'd all woven. The ambulance came, the police too. Questions were asked, but I hardly remember what was said. My mind was stuck on her, on the look of fear in her eyes when that intruder grabbed her. Sitting in the hospital, waiting for news, I felt a wave of regret. This mess, it wasn't just about me and my bruised ego anymore. It had spiraled into something dangerous, something that could have cost us much more than our marriage. I couldn't help but think about how it all started, a simple affair that blew up into this nightmare. And there I was, in the middle of it, wondering how a quest for revenge led to my wife lying in a hospital bed. The doctor said she'd be okay, just some cuts and bruises, but I knew the scars would run deeper than that. We'd both be scarred, in ways that wouldn't just heal with time. That night, sitting by her hospital bed, watching her sleep, I realized how far I'd strayed from the man I used to be, the man she married. I was lost in this maze of anger and revenge, and I dragged everyone I cared about down with me. It was a wake-up call, loud and clear. But the question that kept gnawing at me was, is it too late? Too late to fix things. Too late to go back to who we were. I guess some questions don't have easy answers. But one thing was certain, this was a turning point, one way or another. The hospital corridors echoed with the sound of my footsteps as I paced back and forth, a mix of anxiety and anger churning inside me. My wife, lying in that sterile hospital room, was a vivid reminder of how far we'd all strayed from the path. In the midst of this chaos, secrets began to unravel, like threads pulled from a delicate fabric. The lover, my long-lost brother, finally confessed. It wasn't just infidelity. He admitted to crimes from his past, things that made my blood run cold. He talked about debts, about running from people who weren't keen on letting things slide. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a criminal. Hearing his confession, something inside me snapped. I confronted him right there in the hospital, not caring who heard. How could you? I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. You come back into our lives, and you bring this chaos with you. His eyes, full of regret, didn't calm the storm inside me. I was beyond furious. I wanted to shake him, to make him understand the pain he'd caused. Meanwhile, Laura, my sister-in-law, was having her own crisis. The pregnancy, the affair, it was all crashing down on her. She confided in me, her voice trembling. I don't know if I did the right thing. I could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear. What had started as a reckless affair was now a reality she wasn't sure she could handle. And then there was my wife. After the doctors tended to her, she had a moment of clarity. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. I played a part in this, she whispered. I pushed you away, I ignored what we had. Her admission was a gut punch. Despite everything, a part of me still cared for her, still remembered the good times before all this mess. The hospital drama, the confessions, the doubts, it was like watching the final pieces of our life together crumble away. I sat there, in a hard plastic chair, staring at the white hospital walls, and it all hit me. The affair, the revenge, the anger, it hadn't solved anything. It only served to tear apart what was left of us. In the silence of that hospital room, with the beeping of machines and the distant sound of nurses' footsteps, I felt a profound sense of loss. Loss of my marriage, loss of what could have been with Laura, loss of the family I once had. The revelations, the confrontations, they didn't bring any relief. Instead, they left a bitter taste, a realization of how much damage we'd all done to each other. Sitting there, in the dim light of the hospital, I wondered if there was any way back from this, or if we were all too far gone. The web of lies, the hurt, the betrayal, it was all laid bare, leaving us exposed and vulnerable in the face of our own brokenness. The hospital waiting room turned into a battleground that day. Words were thrown like grenades, each one exploding with years of pent-up frustration and pain. It was all out in the open now, the affair, the lies, the betrayal. My wife, her eyes red from crying, her voice hoarse from yelling, was a portrait of despair. Then the cops showed up. My brother, the lover, the cause of all this mess, they cuffed him right there. Turns out, those crimes he confessed to were more serious than any of us thought. Watching him being led away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that his poisonous influence was gone. Sadness for the brother I never really knew. Laura, my sister-in-law, the other woman in this twisted tale, she had her own bombshell to drop. She was leaving town, she said. The baby, our baby, it was all too much for her. She couldn't bear the weight of the scandal, the looks, the whispers. I couldn't blame her, but it felt like another piece of my world slipping away. Then there was me, standing amidst the wreckage of my own making. The anger and the need for revenge that had driven me, it seemed so pointless now. I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw the damage I'd done. I'd pushed her into another man's arms, driven her sister away, ruined what little family I had left. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to try and fix things. But what could I say? Sorry I slept with your sister? Sorry I broke our vows. It all sounded so hollow. I felt the weight of my choices, heavy on my shoulders, a burden I'd carry for the rest of my life. My wife, once the center of my world, now a stranger, she sat there, all alone. Everyone had left her, me, her lover, her sister. She was the eye of this storm, calm, yet surrounded by destruction. I wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but I knew it was too late. I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. That day, In the sterile cold of the hospital, I realized the true cost of my actions. It wasn't just a marriage that was broken, it was lives, it was trust, it was the future. I walked out of that hospital a different man, a man full of remorse, unsure of where to go or what to do next. My wife, left behind in that room, her world shattered, was a reminder of the love we once had, a love I'd tossed away in a fit of rage and hurt. As I stepped into the dim light of the hallway, the reality of my solitude hit me. I was alone, truly alone, and it was all my own doing. When my brother's trial started, it was like opening a Pandora's box. The courtroom was packed, everyone eager to witness the downfall of a man who'd become the town's latest scandal. The prosecutor laid out his crimes: fraud, theft, a list that seemed to go on forever. I sat there, listening to the litany of his misdeeds, feeling a mix of disgust and pity. This was my flesh and blood, but he was a stranger to me, his life a series of bad choices that had finally caught up to him. As the trial unfolded, so did our private lives, splashed across the local news like some sordid soap opera. Our neighbors, friends, even strangers, they all had their opinions, their judgments. We were pariahs, outcasts in our own community. I could see the toll it was taking on my wife. She tried to hold her head high, but I saw the hurt in her eyes, the embarrassment. Then came the blow that knocked the wind out of her sails. My wife lost her job. The scandal was too much for her employer, and just like that, she was out of work. I watched as she struggled to cope with this new reality, the humiliation, the uncertainty. It was more than just a job. It was her identity, her independence, and it had been stripped away because of our collective mistakes. Laura, my sister-in-law, she couldn't handle it anymore. One day, she just packed up and left. No goodbyes, no tearful farewells. Just a note saying she needed to start over. I understood, but it felt like another piece of my life slipping away. The woman carrying my child, gone, maybe for good. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't stay here, in this town, with all its memories and judging eyes. I needed a fresh start, away from the chaos I'd helped create. So, I packed my bags, sold what little I had left, and left. Left my home, my wife, the life we'd built together. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was necessary. A clean break from a past that was suffocating me. My wife, she was left to deal with the aftermath alone. Financially and emotionally, she was in ruins. The house, our home, it was just another casualty of our shattered lives. She had to let it go, move somewhere smaller, cheaper. I heard about it from mutual friends, each update like a stab to my already guilty heart. Then, out of the blue, an old friend visited her. Someone from happier times, someone who reminded her of who she used to be. I wasn't there, but I heard it gave her some comfort, a brief respite from the loneliness that had become her constant companion. The final straw was when she came to say goodbye. She stood on my doorstep, a shadow of the woman I'd married. We didn't say much. What was there to say? It was a farewell filled with regret, with what-ifs and if-onlys. I watched her drive away, knowing it was the last time I'd see her. Alone in my new place, I thought about her, about all of it. The love we'd shared, the life we'd built, and how I'd let my need for revenge destroy it all. I reflected on my choices, each one leading me further down a path I never intended to take. In the end, my wife was left to face a future that looked nothing like she'd planned. Alone, full of regrets, a life upended by mistakes, both hers and mine. We'd both reached the end of the line, but in very different ways. And as I sat there, staring at the empty walls of my new life, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all worth it? The affair, the revenge, the pain we'd caused each other? The answer was as clear as it was painful. No, It wasn't worth it. Okay, let's get real for a second. You know how they say life's what happens when you're busy making other plans? Well, mine decided to implode while I was busy scrolling through old Paris pics, trying to remember why Michael and I were the perfect couple. Our fifth anniversary was a quiet affair, just us, a homemade dinner, and the ghosts of a honeymoon spent in Paris. Romantic, right? Except that spark, that insane connection we had. It felt like it was fading into a routine so comfortable, it was almost suffocating. Michael, with his head buried in spreadsheets, and me, grading papers until my eyes blurred. Movies became our conversation, silence our soundtrack. But here's where it gets juicy. Enter David, the new gym instructor with a smile that could light up a black hole and an interest in my day that seemed revolutionary after months of, "How was work?" Met with grunts from Michael. "Can you blame me for craving a bit more excitement?" David was like a live wire, electrifying my dull days with just a glance. So, yeah, I fell, hard and fast, into something that felt a lot like recklessness wrapped in desire. It started with coffees after my workout, just as friends. But who are we kidding? Each laugh, each shared secret, pulled me further away from my husband and deeper into David's orbit. I told myself it was just a bit of fun, a harmless distraction from the monotony. But as we crossed that line, the one I promised myself I'd never even approach, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to crash and burn. Yet, I couldn't stop. Michael became a shadow, and David, my son. And that's where it all began, folks. My descent into a world of lies, lust, and eventually loss. Buckle up, because trust me, this ride's just getting started. Picture this. It's another mundane Tuesday, or it was supposed to be until my world started spinning on its axis, and not in the fun, dizzy on a playground kind of way. There I was, sprawled on the couch, half watching some forgettable show, when Michael decides to play detective with my phone. And boom, just like that, he finds a text from David. "Who's David?" he asks, voice colder than our freezer. "Oh, just a new friend from the gym," I reply, my heart racing like I've just run a marathon. Michael buys it, but the look in his eyes tells me this is far from over. And let me tell you, juggling a husband and a lover? It's like riding a roller coaster with no safety harness. Every stolen moment with David sends adrenaline pumping through my veins, but it's paired with a gnawing guilt that eats at me during the quiet nights. It's exhilarating and exhausting, and I can't seem to stop. But then, Michael's suspicions start to bubble up like a pot left too long on the stove. He questions my late gym sessions, the unexplained absences, the smell of cologne that definitely isn't his. And one evening, he finally explodes, confronting me with accusations I can't entirely dodge. I lie through my teeth, denying everything. But the trust between us cracks, spider webbing out into something ugly. The climax? Michael stumbles upon an email from David that I thought I'd deleted. It's like watching a car crash in slow motion. You want to look away, but you just can't. My heart sinks as he reads it, each word a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I deny it, again, desperation making my voice shake. But the damage is done. Michael packs a bag and leaves to stay with his brother, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a suffocating blanket of regret. That night, the house feels emptier than it ever has, and I'm left wondering how I let things get this far. The thrill of the affair has vanished, replaced by a deep, aching void. I'm conflicted, torn between the life I've built with Michael and the reckless abandon David represents. It's a mess, a complicated web of lies and emotions, and for the first time, I'm not sure if I can, or even want to, untangle it. The moment Michael walked out, it was like the universe handed me a get-out-of-jail-free card. No more sneaking around, no more lies. Just me, David, and the thrill of the forbidden. It felt like freedom, like I was finally breathing after being underwater for so long. But here's the thing about playing with fire, you're bound to get burned. It hit me out of nowhere, the gut punch that changed everything. There I was, thinking I'm living some sort of dream, when I overhear David. He wasn't just talking. He was boasting, bragging to his buddy about how he'd scored the unhappy housewife. My heart didn't just break, it shattered. All the lies I'd told myself about David caring for me, about us having something real, evaporated in an instant. I was just another notch on his belt, a game to be won. Confronting David was like ripping off a band-aid. Quick, painful, and necessary. I ended it, right there, with a few choice words and a storm of tears waiting to be unleashed the moment I was alone. And boy, did they come. I was a mess, a mix of anger, betrayal, and the dawning realization of the colossal mistake I'd made. So, I did what any desperate, heartbroken person would do. I tried to go back. Back to Michael. Back to the life I'd so recklessly thrown away. I poured my heart out, told him everything. The affair, the breakup, the crushing realization of my own foolishness. I begged for forgiveness, for a second chance. But Michael, oh Michael, he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since this whole mess started. And what did he see? A stranger. He filed for divorce, and just like that, the final door slammed shut on what we once had. You'd think that was rock bottom, right? But no. The universe had one more twist in store. David, the cause of all this chaos, moved on to his next conquest. My sister, Emily. The betrayal sliced through the already gaping wound in my heart. It wasn't just my marriage that was destroyed. My family was fracturing too. Desperation doesn't even begin to cover what I felt. It was a mix of horror, disbelief, and a profound, soul-crushing regret. I'd lost Michael, I'd lost myself, and now, it seemed, I was losing my sister too. All because of choices I made. Because of a path I chose to walk down. And as I stood there, watching my world continue to crumble, I couldn't help but wonder, was any of it worth it? The answer, as much as it pained me to admit, was a resounding no. The moment I realized David had moved on to Emily, my sister, it felt like I was living in some twisted soap opera. Except, in those shows, you can switch off the TV. Me? I was stuck in the nightmare, no remote in sight. Emily, bless her heart, was clueless about the storm she'd just walked into. David, the guy who'd left my life in shambles, was now wooing my sister with the same charm that had fooled me. The rift it caused between us? Grand Canyon-sized. Isolated doesn't even begin to cover how I felt. It was like I'd been exiled, not just from my family, but from everyone I cared about. Friends who were once mutual with Michael picked sides, and spoiler alert, no one picked Team Anna. It was a loneliness I'd never known, and it forced me to look in the mirror for the first time in a long while. And let me tell you, I didn't like what I saw. Amidst this, the divorce papers came. Michael was as cold and distant as a distant star, and who could blame him? Every meeting, every signature, was a reminder of the mess I'd made. It was official. I was losing everything I'd once held dear. But life has a funny way of kicking you when you're down, because that's when Emily found out. Found out about me and David. About the lies and the affair. The betrayal she felt was palpable, and watching her break off with David brought me no joy. Just a profound sadness for the chaos I'd caused. David? He left town shortly after, his trail of destruction complete. The road to rebuilding was more like climbing a mountain with no summit in sight. Trying to mend things with Emily was my first step, but she was resistant, understandably. Each attempt to reach out was met with coldness, a mirror of the distance I'd felt with Michael. But I was determined, or maybe just stubborn. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this whole disaster, it's that some bridges, no matter how charred, are worth trying to rebuild. So here I am, taking it one day at a time, learning to live with the consequences of my choices. It's not easy, and I doubt it ever will be, but if there's a chance to fix even a fraction of the hurt I've caused, you better believe I'm going to take it. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about making amends, it's about finding a way to forgive myself. And maybe, just maybe, finding a way back to the people I love. The whispers started the moment I stepped back into the real world, a world I'd almost forgotten existed outside the bubble of my own drama. Walking into work, it felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter, each glance and hushed conversation a reminder of the scandal I'd become. There she goes, they'd whisper, as if I couldn't hear them, as if I wasn't already drowning in my own pool of regret. It was like being back in high school, only worse, because this time I knew I deserved it. And let's not even start on the financial mess. The divorce settlement? It hit me like a freight train, leading me to pick up the pieces of my shattered lifestyle. Suddenly, I'm juggling bills I can't pay and a lifestyle I can't afford, all on a teacher's salary. Nights out? Designer clothes? Those became relics of a past life, replaced by budget spreadsheets that never seemed to add up. Loneliness became my constant companion, a shadow that followed me even into crowded rooms. It's one thing to be alone, it's another to feel alone in a room full of people. My bed felt too big, my home too quiet, and my thoughts too loud. Every what if and if only played on loop in my mind, a cruel soundtrack to my newfound solitude. That's when I realized I couldn't do it alone. Therapy wasn't just an option. It was a lifeline. Sitting on that couch every Thursday at 4 p.m., I started to untangle the web of guilt, shame, and regret I'd woven around myself. It was hard, probably the hardest thing I've ever done. But week by week, I started to see glimmers of the person I used to be, the person I could be again. Armed with a fragile new sense of self-worth, I began to venture out again, attending social events solo. It was awkward at first, showing up alone, feeling out of place and time. But slowly, I started to make connections. Real ones, built on shared interests and genuine conversations rather than the superficial ties of my previous life. Work, though, remained a battleground. My professional reputation had taken a hit, and no amount of late nights or early mornings seemed to make a difference. I was the woman who had it all and threw it away, a cautionary tale in flesh and blood. But every challenge, every whispered judgment, became a stepping stone. I was determined to prove them wrong, to prove to myself that I wasn't just the sum of my mistakes. So, here I am, fighting my way back, inch by painstaking inch. It's not easy, and some days, it feels like I'm barely holding on. But for the first time in a long time, I have something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. Hope for a future that's different from my past, hope for a chance to rewrite my story. And maybe, just maybe, that's all I need. The day I sat down to write that letter to Michael, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. It was more than just a letter, it was a confession, an apology, and a goodbye all rolled into one. I poured everything into it, every shred of guilt, every apology I had in me. Dropping it in the mailbox felt like letting go of a balloon, watching it drift away, knowing you can't get it back. And when he never responded, it was the silence that said everything. It was time to move on, truly move on. So, I threw myself into self-improvement like a woman possessed. Yoga, painting, a night class in creative writing, you name it, I tried it. It wasn't just about filling the hours, it was about rebuilding myself from the ground up, piece by piece. Each new hobby was a step away from the person I'd been, and a step toward the person I wanted to be. The road to reconciliation with Emily was long and fraught with awkward starts and painful stops. But the day she finally forgave me, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds after a storm. Her forgiveness wasn't given lightly, and I didn't accept it lightly. It was a promise, a vow to do better, be better. And then, just when I thought I was content being on my own, he walked into my life. Someone new, someone unexpected. He was kind, funny, and had a gentleness about him that made me feel safe. But the scars of my past made me cautious, hesitant to jump into anything too quickly. I was learning to trust again, but more importantly, I was learning to trust myself. Community service became my way of giving back, a chance to make amends in a small way. Whether it was serving meals at the homeless shelter or organizing charity events, each act of service was a step toward redemption. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a future. Rebuilding trust, especially with the people who'd seen me at my worst, was a painstaking process. There were no shortcuts, no easy fixes. But every day I showed up. I showed up for my family, for my friends, and most of all, for myself. It was a slow journey, filled with small victories and setbacks. But with each step forward, I was proving to them, and to me, that people can change, that we're not defined by our lowest moments. Looking back, I realize how far I've come. From the ashes of my old life, I've built something new, something better. It's not perfect, and I'm not perfect. But maybe, just maybe, that's okay. The day I landed in the hospital, clutching my chest, thinking it was the end, was the day my life flashed before my eyes. Not the highlight reel, but the bloopers, the mistakes, the heartaches, the time lost. Lying in that sterile bed, hooked up to a symphony of beeps and drips, the reality hit me like a freight train. The stress of my past, the wreckage I'd caused, it wasn't just emotional. It was physical, too. It was a wake-up call, loud and clear. Something had to change. The path to healing was slow, paved with doctors' visits and a newfound respect for my health. But it wasn't just my body that needed mending. My family ties were frayed, hanging by a thread. So, when we finally sat down for a family reunion, it was with cautious optimism. We tiptoed around the elephant in the room until we couldn't anymore. Acknowledging the past, we decided to look to the future. A future where we could be a family again, scars and all. But just as one part of my life seemed to be piecing back together, another was fraying. My new relationship, once a beacon of hope, was now clouded with doubts. My partner struggled with the shadows of my past, the whispers of mistrust. It was a different kind of heartache, one that made me question if I was doomed to repeat the same mistakes. Amidst the turmoil, a quiet realization blossomed within me. Self-acceptance. It wasn't about erasing my past or ignoring my flaws. It was about acknowledging them, owning them, and recognizing that I was still worthy of love, happiness, and a second chance. This newfound acceptance became my armor, my strength. Financially, the road to recovery was littered with obstacles, but I tackled them head on. Budgeting, saving, even picking up extra shifts. Whatever it took to regain control. With each paid bill, each small financial victory, I felt a little more like the captain of my ship, steering away from the storm. Reconnecting with old friends was a gamble. I reached out, half expecting to be met with silence or disdain. But to my surprise, some doors opened. Conversations were had, coffees were shared, and slowly, the bridges I thought I'd burned started to show signs of repair. It wasn't universal forgiveness, but it was a start. Professionally, I hit a milestone. A project I'd poured my heart and soul into was recognized, celebrated even. It was a vindication, a public declaration that I was more than my personal failures. I was competent, capable, and deserving of respect. This journey of personal growth was often painful, a series of steps forward and inevitable slides back. But with each challenge, I found a resilience I didn't know I had. I wasn't the same person who had made those mistakes. I was someone new, someone better. The recognition I received for my community service was a bittersweet reminder of why I started in the first place: to make amends, to give back, to find redemption. It wasn't about the accolades. It was about the difference I was making, one small act at a time. As my new relationship weathered its storms, it emerged stronger, more resilient. My partner began to see the woman I'd become, not just the woman I'd been. We built a foundation of trust, understanding, and acceptance, proving that love could flourish even in the rockiest of soils. Looking forward, I'm filled with a cautious optimism. The past will always be a part of me, but it doesn't define me. I've learned, I've grown, and I've changed. The future is unwritten, a blank page waiting for new stories, new memories, and new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, I'm excited